It's interesting to think about how fair trade has moved on and how it's much more mainstream now. But what we're going to look at a little bit today is not so much the idea of buying fair trade, really, but the idea of how God expects us to live in the world that we live in. And, as Philip said about Lent is a period of self-examination. So it's a good time perhaps to stop and think about how we use our gifts, how we use our money, and are we mindful of the mission that we have from Jesus. So the Old Testament points to Jesus and the coming of his kingdom. So I'm just going to read you a bit from Isaiah chapter 61. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendour. And then in Luke, Jesus repeats those words when he's rejected at Nazareth, and he goes into the temple and to the synagogue, and he stands up and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." So we can see the direct link between the promises of the Old Testament and the fulfilment in the New Testament, and the covenant of the rainbow and Noah's Ark is another example of God's promise and God's trustworthiness. So the arrival of Jesus, it sort of fulfills the longing for justice that saturates the prophetic writings in the Old Testament and the Psalms. And the recurring questions that perhaps we ask ourselves as well. Does God not see the wicked prosper and the righteous falter? Will God act to deliver the poor, the captives, the blind, the oppressed? And these questions were answered definitively in Jesus. So the original hearers of both Isaiah and Jesus would probably have pictured the idea of an entire people rather than individuals. The people of Israel were in exile. They were poor and captive, unable to see a way out of their opposition, of their oppression. So they'd had experience of this. It was in their stories, this sense of injustice. And Jesus is good news for those that live in these sorts of circumstances. And again, we're seeing at the moment the mass movement of people from conflicts in the Middle East. So God answers those questions in Jesus. Does he see the problems that we see? Yes, he does. He does see the inequalities, and he will act, and he has acted in the most dramatic way possible. And that was by joining Israel's story with the human story, by bringing us Jesus as a human in the flesh. So through Jesus' suffering and triumphing over the violence that he suffered, he pours out his Spirit on the people, and we bear that anointing to bring the news of the Lord's favour to the world. So it's kind of passed on from Isaiah to Jesus, and then from Jesus passed on to us. This is where my notes get a bit scrappy, so I might get a bit lost. So it seems that if we think of it in that way, we can't understand Jesus and his mission without understanding that the Bible has a deep yearning for justice, and Jesus' announcement that he was the fulfillment of that yearning. So it seems you cannot have Jesus without justice. But what about justice without Jesus? In our society, the answer would probably be yes. Most people see the need to secure the rights of the poor and the oppressed. Political and economic systems should allow dignity and opportunity for those people. Most people in the world would agree with that. But as followers of Jesus, surely we see how thin the secular notion of justice is, beside the sweeping vision that Isaiah gave us and that Jesus took to be his own. Isaiah's prophecies weren't just procedural remedies, they weren't just ways to run the government or to finance big companies, but they were relational ones too. He believes that the deepest need of God's people is for God's presence, for us to experience his shalom-bringing, justice-enacting presence among his people. Isaiah is promising our secular ideals of justice, but in the context of a relationship between God and his people. Jesus pursued this relationship relentlessly. When we read through the New Testament, he healed people, he made friends with undesirables. He was in the places where other people didn't want to go. Relationship was as important to him as justice. So can you have justice without Jesus? Not biblical, life-giving, restoring justice. Biblical justice, the restoration of all things to their created fruitfulness with the one who made them. God keeps his promises. In the Old Testament, we see many prophecies that have come to fulfillment in the New Testament. So we've got evidence that we can trust God. So we can trust God with the other things in our lives. And of course, with that trust, God gives us something that he hopes that we will use for the good of others. We do have, as the video showed, we're in the small minority of people in the world that after this will go home to a house, probably with Wi-Fi, probably with lunch. You know, we're in a minority, tiny minority really, of the world. And that's not justice, that's not God's kingdom. So as followers of Jesus, we need to consider how our lives and the power that we have as that minority can be used to bring the kingdom vision of justice to others. Jesus is building his kingdom, and we have a significant role to play in that. As we heard in the reading from James, faith without works is dead. It's no good saying to somebody poor and lonely and cold on the street, oh, you know, sorry about that, but I hope you feel better tomorrow. It's not going to help, is it? We've got to think about how we can help others. And on the other hand, of course, when Jesus healed the man that they put down through the ceiling, the first thing he did was heal his sins, forgive his sins. So again, it's showing that that relationship is so important, as well as justice. So every time we act justly, love mercy, or walk humbly with God, we bring the kingdom closer. Justice cannot be separated from Jesus. It must be integral to our relationship with others and with him. Amen.